Good morning. We're jumping into part 3 this morning of our Brother, Where Art Thou series, talking about relationships. The ushers are just going to help us right now receive your offerings, for which we say thank you for your constant support of what we do here at Westside. You're on page 58 in the journal if you're following along in the journal, as your journal slowly fills up and you realize that Christmas is getting closer and closer and closer. In week 1, you may remember Adam talked to us about Cain and Abel and the whole concept of scarcity and how we live and how that affects how we live. Last week, you remember that Bob shared with us about this, hugely famous story of conflict in the Bible between Jacob and Esau. This morning, I want to talk about another key piece in the biblical story, and that's us. We might not be in the Bible, but we are forming part of this story that Jesus has called us to be part of. So I want to do that by talking about us and our relationships this morning, and we'll begin with a very, very short story from Mark's Gospel, chapter 9 and verse 33. It says this: They, that is the disciples, came to Capernaum. When he, that's Jesus, was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" Just as a brief interruption on this reading for a moment, you kind of imagine if the Son of God, right, God incarnate, hung out with us all, he would ask really deep philosophical questions. You know, which is harder, for me to make a rock so big that I can't lift, but instead he asks things like, what were you arguing about on the road? It's like Jesus is dad. You know, seriously, what's going on up there? That sort of, that? Maybe some parents, that you've said that already today. What is happening upstairs? The disciples respond exactly the way when you ask that question or were asked that question. They kept quiet because on the way, they had argued about who was the greatest. I mean, you commit 3 years of life to follow the incarnate God around the desert, and you argue over who's the best. My dad is better and stronger than your dad. To which, of course, the only answer is, yeah, so is my mom. This is like a classic schoolboy conflict, isn't it? I'm better than you. Are you better than me? I think I'm better than you. Let me tell you why I think I'm better than you. Well, no. I'm better than this. This is every conversation with a group of men you've ever had. There was this one time we were snowboarding and we snowboarded off a 20-foot hill. Well, that was just one time I was snowboarding. It was a 30-foot hill. 30-foot hill, I do that on my way to work in the morning. And this is the sort of conversation that Jesus' disciples are having. Now, we laugh about the conversation, and part of the reason is because it's so true to us. We're always wondering about who's the best. Now, we don't often ask it like that. We don't lean over the fence and go, "Hey, neighbor, do you think I'm better than you?" But when your neighbor buys a bigger car, you're like, what does he think? He's better than me? This conflict that we get involved in, this perception that we need to be the best, that we need to be superior, seems to be kind of part of what it is to be human at some level. We're constantly wrestling with one another. I think some of this speaks back to what Adam was talking about in week 1, this idea of scarcity. If there's not enough for all of us to be the best, then I must make sure at very least I'm the best. I've got to be the one that's in charge. I've got to be the one that's the lead. There's not enough stuff, so we've got to get this stuff and we've got to keep it for ourselves. The sociologist George Foster said this several years ago now. He said the idea of scarcity causes someone, and here's his quote, to view their social, economic, and natural universes, their total environment, as one in which all of the desired things in life, such as land and wealth and health, friendship and love, manliness and honor, respect and status, power and influence, security and safety, exist in finite quantity and are always in short supply. It's basically that feeling that what you really want in life, there isn't just quite enough of. So the key is, make sure you get it before anyone else does. Now, a lot of times sociologists will talk about this sort of concept as the idea of limited good when they analyze primitive societies. But I find when I think about our own society, is this idea that the stuff that we want is in short supply, is it maybe still present in the world today? Is it maybe still what motivates so many of us to live our lives the way that we do? Now, you think about the political scene is almost entirely motivated by our perceptions that there's not enough for everyone. Is immigration a political issue, or is it an issue about our perception that there's not enough space for all of us? Now you say, hey, I don't do politics in church. We don't want any of that. Okay, well, let me ask this question. When someone else gets a promotion in your job, how does that make you feel? And why is it that you feel you deserve it and not them? Or when your neighbor buys that new car, why is it you start looking at car brochures? Why is it when your neighbor gets a new kitchen, your kitchen all of a sudden starts to look a little bad? What is it that's in us that feels like we've got to fight for the stuff that we've got? One of the things we've been saying throughout this series is this, that Jesus followers should reject a scarcity worldview. We've got to reject this idea that we've all got to fight for our stuff. We've got to get rid of this idea that there's not enough for all of us. We've got to step away from it. I think there's a huge hint as to how Jesus wants us to live when he says, this is how you should pray. And he doesn't say, my Father in heaven. Instead, what Jesus says is, our Father in heaven. It's as if Jesus wants us to think about community. It's as if he wants us to remember that we're all in this together. We often want to pray, my Father, but Jesus calls us to think about the other, to think about the other person, the other people that we are involved with. I think Jesus had already responded to the disciples' conflict as well when the disciples were arguing about who is the greatest. We find ourselves drawn back to another story of Jesus when he responds to the idea of scarcity. In a world where we want to defend our stuff, we want to preserve our stuff, we want to keep our stuff, Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 5, you are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Listen, when you have stuff, you often want to keep it. It's nice to have stuff. How happy is your life? And how much is that happiness connected to the number that you see in your bank account when you look? The higher that number is, the happier we often feel, the safer we feel, the more secure we feel, the more ready for disasters we feel. Basically what we're saying is our happiness is linked to how much stuff we can gather around us, how much stuff we can keep for ourselves. And yet Jesus comes along in that kind of annoying way that only Jesus does. He comes along and says, hey, listen, what if you shared your stuff? What if perhaps the way I designed you and built you was that you got stuff and then you shared it? Kind of like being a light. Nobody lights a light and then says, keep all the light to myself. You know, like, hey, neighbor, I've noticed that my light is kind of shining on your yard, so I'm going to build a wall because that's my light. That's not your light. And I'm paying that bill. And Jesus is like, that would be ridiculous, right? But yet, how ridiculous is it then that we think it's perfectly normal to gather stuff and keep it all for ourselves? Our relationships are often affected by the fact that we want to be the best and we want to have the most. We want to be better than everybody else. So maybe we can say it like this. The call of Jesus is to share, not stockpile. This is the Jesus relational method. That your relationships are defined by what you share, not by what you keep. In Hebrews chapter 13, right towards the end of the Bible, one of these annoying verses. There's a lot of annoying verses in the Bible. You know that. You feel like it's not godly to admit it, but there's a lot of verses in the Bible that are so annoying you just don't read them. In Hebrews chapter 13, verse 16, it says this, do good, oh that's okay, and share, not so okay. Do good and share, and then to really irritate you, because this pleases God. It's so simple, it's really irritating. Do good and share because this pleases God. It echoes something Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, where he said, don't store up your treasures on earth where moth and rust and thief get to them, but store up your treasures in heaven. There's two parts to this for us. This idea of sharing and not stockpiling is a relational approach. It requires this from us. Number one, it requires us to reject the feeling that we have, and I don't know where it comes from, but this feeling that we have that someone else has got what's really yours. Like, why on earth did they give him that job? I'm so much better. Can they not see I'm more awesome than him, and yet he got the job? How on earth have they gone on that vacation? I've been to his job. He does no work, and now they're going on a cruise? And there's this kind of deep bitterness that we have that somehow other people are getting our stuff. You see, the disciples of Jesus arguing about it all the time. Well, I must be better than you. Can I sit next to you here or there? It's something in the human condition that we feel like, and it goes back to this idea of scarcity, that when somebody else gets stuff, it's being taken from us. The other side to living this way, I think, that's important for us is that we reject the temptation to act in such a self-promoting way that it's difficult to be ourselves. Have you ever been in that sort of pressure? That you know kind of really who you are. You're aware of what you should be and how to be yourself. But you're also aware of that to get that promotion that you want, to get noticed by that person that you want, you have to act in this particular way. And you get constantly drawn out of what is your normal, natural behavior. You get drawn out of who God designed you to be into being someone else. How often have you heard someone leave a job because it finally got so much for them and they just sort of said, I couldn't be myself anymore? And when they're telling you that, you find yourself asking, goodness, am I not being myself in my own job? And how easy it sneaks up on us that we get dragged in a way in order to try and be the greatest. We get dragged away from being what we're greatest at, which is being ourselves. The writer Marianne Williamson, in her book, A Return to Love, said this: it's our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, and fabulous? Questions I ask myself on a... No, I'm joking. Actually, who are you not to be? She says, you are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine as children do. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It's not just in some of us. It's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. You may recognize this quote. It was quoted during Nelson Mandela's inauguration speech when he took on the role of being president of South Africa. But many of us love this quote but are scared to live it. Scared to live the way that says, actually, I'm called to shine the way God made me to be, not to get involved in this fighting for position, this fighting for status, and pretending to be something I'm not, just so that the world will accept me in a particular way. But you see, I think this is really difficult for us because we're really bad at living in community. We're really bad at living with one another. We do all sorts of weird, strange stuff when we live together, when we come together as community, when we live in our environment. I think it's because we live in a really distracted community nowadays. Maybe you don't, right? But for the rest of us, let me ask you this question. Do you know all your neighbors' names? And my grandmother could give you a life history of the grandchildren of people that used to live next door, right? Now listen, I'm not one of those, hey, it was great in the good old days. We had a couple of big wars that remind us that we didn't get along back then either. But, seriously, she knew her neighbors. She knew the community that she lived in. And she would talk to us about them. She would explain the journey that we'd all been on and how we got there and who'd married who and what their all names were. Hey, another slightly more painful question. How many people do you know on the row that you're sat on right now? We can live in such a distracted community that it's possible to come into a place every single week and not actually really know each other very well. Hey, listen, if we live in a distracted community, let me ask you this question. How many times have you checked your phone in the last hour? How difficult is it for you to be somewhere without checking your phone? Have you stopped going to the cinema? You don't go to movies anymore because they're too long and someone might Facebook me. There's that core human belief that we really are the greatest. Because if I don't have access to my phone at any moment, who knows what could happen? You've seen 24, right? When Jack Bauer lost his phone, it all went to pot. So what if I lost my phone because I'm properly important here? You don't believe me? What about this lady? This lady lives in the moment. I was at Lake Louise for the first time yesterday. And I stood there Fortunately, I'm not quite as tall as some people, but I'm tall enough to see over all the people that had traveled thousands of miles to look at Lake Louise through their camera phone. You know, they're like this. Well, this is a beautiful sight. You know, Lake Louise, it's about 6 inches, you know. This lady, to me, expresses some of the beauty of not living in distracted community. She's in the moment. Everybody else wants to preserve the moment, so they miss it. She lives there. Perhaps let me ask you this question. Is your social media friend list bigger than your actual friend list? You have more friends on the internet than you do in real life? How come you know the name of that guy in China, but not the guy at 53? The guy that lives across the street, you know, I don't really like him, but that other guy I know in Australia that we talk on the internet all the time, we're really great friends, and he just liked my photo, so we're close. Social media calls us into a really strange relational world that I'm not sure we're all aware of how badly it's affecting us. Think about this. You can add and delete friends. Have you ever tried to do that in real life? I mean, that's like really hard. They keep coming back. You're like, what are you doing here, dude? I deleted you last week. We're not doing the baseball anymore because you support a different team from me. Or I noticed you liked that political picture, so we're unfriended now. You know? And they've even created buttons that allow us to stop following someone but not let that person know. Because the last thing you would ever want anyone to know is that you weren't friends anymore. Listen, I mean this seriously. You know, think about the life that we live. We like feeling in control of these social media worlds, but this actually stops us from learning some of the key skills of what it is to be human. To be in relationship with people that you can't control. Relationships are awkward, they're difficult because people do stuff that you don't have any control over, and you can't mute them, turn them off, unfollow them, or move to a different social media platform. In real life, you have to work at this stuff. You have to dialogue this stuff. Social media is easy because you can avoid all the controversy you want. Apart from those other people, you know, you've all got that one friend who seems to just live for controversy on social media. You know, I'd come to your house for that party, but there's some stuff I've got to do on Twitter. But for most of us, we are allowing ourselves to tailor our lives, that we only hear echoes of our own voice when we switch on our phones, and it makes us feel, and here's the danger, that our view is the only view. And it makes us feel that we're normal and everybody else is weird. And it makes community really difficult. And as Bob talked about last week, it actually draws us into loneliness. We feel like we've got all the friends in the world, but actually we're deeply lonely because we're shaping a community of people we don't really know around us that are just like us. So here we are in the 21st century in a social media world, and I want to ask this question: how does the church combat this loss of community? How does the church deal with this? The sociologists Bauman and Donskis talk about how our loss of community is coming around because we're being increasingly individualistic. It's a me world, so I'm not so bothered about community. And then here we all are on a Sunday morning in Calgary, gathered together. Not as a group of individuals, but as a group, as a people, as a church. And I think the answer to how can the church combat this loss of community is very simple. It's simply this: by being the church. See, because the church is the place where we do all come together, where we are one another. We're not individuals and here's my opinion and this is how I work, and if it's not exactly like I want it, then I'm going to another church. I mean, sure, there are some people try and do that, but for the rest of us that are actually thinking, here we are every week, and we're part of something that's bigger than us, that isn't solely focused on us, it's focused on Jesus. You see, I might put it like this: we all want a personal Savior, but Jesus gave us a church. We want my Jesus, right? We want the personal Jesus, the buddy Jesus, the Jesus we keep in our pocket, we bring out when we need it. I saw a Jesus in a gift store yesterday that had sticky feet you could put on your dashboard, and he bounced as you drove. We like that Jesus because he's constantly approving of us, and it's all about me. You know, the phrase personal Savior is just not in the Bible. The church is a phrase in the Bible all the time. We want individual Jesus, and Jesus gives us community Jesus. Jesus didn't come to save you, he came to save all of us. He brings us together into community. I want to confess that church is the place where we all come together to work out what it means to be Christian. You can't work out what it means to be Christian on your own, because you just end up with who's the greatest, who's the best, and it's all about me, the individual. But I want to push that further and say, I don't think you can work out what it means to be human outside of the church. In the place that God brought us together and shapes us and forms us, this is what Ephesians 3, verse 10, calls the rich variety of the wisdom of God. It's me in all my weirdness, you in all your normalness. See what I did there? And we come together and we like each other and we enjoy being together despite the fact that we're hugely different, because deep inside our being we realize this is what God made the world to be like. There's very few other places in the world you can go and hang out and come together and actually find people so different from you. The only thing that binds us together is Christ. So when you're in worship and you look around and go, goodness, I wouldn't be friends with any of these people. It's okay, they're looking at you going, I would never be friends with that guy, if it wasn't for church. Because it brings us together, it puts us in the same place. And goodness, that's hard work. Because when we're all so different and we come into this same place, it's easy to have conflict. It's easy to fall out with one another. If two brothers like Cain and Abel and Jacob and Esau, as we saw over the last few weeks, if they can fight, what about people that don't have those ties and commitments? It's so easy to fall out with one another, to become self-obsessed and think it's all about me. Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, says this: one of the misfortunes in the long history of the church is that we have mistakenly separated love of God from love of neighbor when they're always held together in prophetic poetry. This is basically a way of saying that our horizontal relationships, the me and you relationship, is as important as the me and God relationship, the vertical relationship. Now that's a really annoying verse and thought and concept, because I'm really okay with me and Jesus. Me and Jesus, we have a great time. I can go to my room, I can read books, study, pray, think about how great I am, all this sort of stuff, how much Jesus loves me, and I feel Jesus' radiant warmth love on me. I know I want to return that love to Jesus, and Jesus says, yeah, you have to do that by loving you guys. And you guys are like, you think that's hard? We have to love you. Jesus gives us people to love to show how much we love him. We think that the way we love God is just by pouring affection towards him. But as John says in one of his letters, you can't hate your brother and love God. If you say you love God, watch how that works out in your relationships. And that's deeply annoying. It'd be so much easier just to love Jesus on my own. But Jesus calls us to the people that we're sat with right now and says, actually, that's where you work out what it is to be human and what it is to love God. So in contrast to the world, where it's really just about me, in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1, what does it say? It says, if somebody has a hard time, if somebody sins, if somebody falls, the people of God, the spiritual people, they lift that person back up. Because we're constantly working out our love of God with how we love one another. And that's how the Bible works out our relationships. Which brings us back to the philosophical question that Adam mentioned in week 1, the philosophical question that Cain asked, am I my brother's keeper? To which the answer is, yes, you are. I don't really want that to be the case. I'd like to just be responsible for me. But God calls me into community, says your brother and your sister, they matter to you, they're important to you, and you do have to look after them. You do have to care for them. Their life is as important as your life. So the word church literally means a called out people. And God has called us out of an individualistic world and dropped us into a world where relationships matter, where how we treat one another matters. We say we love Jesus, and then Jesus lines us up with people all day long that give us an opportunity to prove how much we love him. Think about this. We come together as church. You notice that everything we do as church is together? Have you always noticed whenever you go to anything church-related, there's other people there? Like, have you ever noticed that nobody ever says, Adam never comes up and does a community piece like this week, Tuesday, 7:30, there's this thing on for the guy in the fourth row, nobody else. Now sometimes everybody acts like that's what we're doing, but actually it's for everyone. The stuff we do is intentionally formative. It's calling us together. We gather together, we talk together, we worship together, we learn together, we do service for God together. That's not just because it's better if there's more people, it's because that works out at the core of what we believe, that God called an us, not an I. He called us to work this out together. One of the most beautiful things we do, and you'll notice it just here at the front and in the middle and at the back, we put out a Eucharist table. And the Eucharist, the gathering together to remember Jesus' death and resurrection and return, I think is a sacrament, it's a liturgy, or however you want to describe it, that brings us together, that remembers we need each other and we all need Jesus. You ever notice that church is like the worst restaurant in the world? Like you come in and think, you know what, I really could go this morning? I could really go a bit of prime rib. That would be kind of nice. You know, and I'm sorry, maybe you're a vegetarian, so I don't know, you woke up thinking about carrots or something. And I don't know, I struggle to relate, I try. And you're like, yeah, I like carrots. And somebody else is like, you know what, I'm really into this whole salted caramel thing that's going on in a minute. I mean, what's that about? Why is everything all of a sudden salted caramel? Like, I thought those were separate food groups. But anyway, so someone else is like that. So then you come up to the table for the communion meal, and it's bread. The same type of bread for everybody. You know, that's not what I ordered. I wanted something like a little different. No, you get the same as everybody else. And then you get to the cup, and somebody missold it as wine. It's not wine. And you're pretty annoyed about that as well. But it's the same wine for everyone. I like white. Nope, sorry, you've got this one. And that's not just because we can't be bothered to offer selection. That's because at the basic part of the middle of communion is the fact that we all need exactly the same Jesus. And it doesn't matter where you come from and what your choices are and what your background is and what position you're at in life, or whether you think you're the greatest or whether you think the person on the row behind you is the greatest. When you come to the table, you realize that we all need the same Jesus. We all need the same Jesus in exactly the same way. And there's this hugely powerful human moment of realizing that actually sometimes our choices don't matter that much. Sometimes what we like and our opinions don't matter that much. Because that person that really annoys you, that sat 4 rows behind you on the other side, they need Jesus just as much as you. And you need Jesus just as much as them. And then for every person that annoys you, you probably annoy someone else. For every conflict you've had with one person that was their fault, you've probably had a conflict with someone else that was your fault. And we all need the same Jesus. So we come to this table, and we take the same bread, and we take the same cup. And we thank Jesus that he brought us together. You can't take communion on your own. You need to take it in community. You need to take it in groups, because it's in the community group that we actually confess Jesus as Lord. It's easy to look like Jesus is Lord when you're on your own. But when you're with others, when other people are gathered with you, and we in all of our diversity, me and my weirdness, you and your normalness, we come together and we realize that Jesus really is Lord, and he has transformed us. And our relationships are profoundly different because we all needed exactly the same Jesus as each other. So I want to invite you to come to the table this morning. I want to invite you to come, take some bread, take a cup, and return to your seat. And as you are sung to, I just want you to reflect on the beautiful power of a Jesus who would die and be exactly what you need. But I also want you to reflect on the Jesus who died and was exactly what everyone else in this room needed as well. And that he called us together. At Westside King's Church, we invite anybody who confesses Jesus as Lord to come and take communion. If that's your confession, then come and share with us and celebrate the diversity. Celebrate the beauty of all of our different relationships, all of our different personalities, that the same Jesus died to save. Why don't you come forward and take it? Until he comes. This is the death that brought us all together. This is the death that says you being you don't need to argue about who's the greatest anymore. You just need to shine. Be the person that God created you to be. Shine brightly as the one that God designed you to be. That's how we live and work out in this community, in our church community, what it is to follow Jesus. Community is ugly. It's messy. It's difficult. But it's also how God's going to save the world. So, Father God, we thank you for the one-size-fits-all blood of Jesus. We thank you that that blood saved all of us. And as we work that out in our relationships, as we work that out as a people here announcing that you are good enough for all of us and that we are good enough for you, God, that you would guide us, direct us, and may our paths be ones that echo your kingdom, that echo the way you would have us live, and that call us to be your people in this world this week. Amen. May God's grace and peace be on you.